Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you all for this very, very special session too. My name is Park Se-il, Professor of Law and Economics at Seoul National University, and currently I'm serving as the president of Hanson Foundation, which is an independent and private, non-partisan think tank composed of about 200 professors and experts focusing on the public policy study on Korea's unification issues and national development strategies. As commonly known, as frequently pointed out, we are now living in the middle of fundamental changes and transformations of the world in many areas and dimensions. For example, financial globalization has made the world economy very volatile, unstable. We know that financial globalization has contributed a lot for the reduction of global poverty on one hand, but on the other hand, it increased the world economy very volatile and unpredictable. The global power is shifting from very rapidly from Atlantic region to Pacific region. In 19th centuries, Europe was the center of the power, global power. 21st century, US was the center of the power, global power, but now it's moving to Asia. We all know that. And right in the aftermath of Cold War, we once experienced so-called unipolar system, unipolar world, represented by US global superpower. But now it's moving rapidly toward multipolar world. Some scholars even argue that we are now moving toward non-polar system. In other words, the global power is being dramatically decentralized and dispersed all around the world. And in addition, we have the problem of global warming and the aging population problems. And also, we have the problem of weapons of mass destruction and the problem of rising mismatch between technological innovation and education reform. And this mismatch between the technology and education system actually are generating what we are experiencing these days, the issue of rising unemployment, especially among college graduate and high school graduate. Moreover, we have the problem of global governance. We have many global issues that should be taken care of by global governance, but the global governance, such as UN and IMF, which we have now, are becoming very ineffective and inadequate. All these problems together make the world extremely complicated, unpredictable, and even unsafe. This special session is designed to identify the most important and fundamental key problems, key issues, key challenges we are having these days among many current global issues, and to discuss how we can cooperate, how we can organize the cooperation between and among the countries, people, universities, and think tanks to tackle the issues we are facing now. So these are the two objectives we are going to deal with in this session. Today, we are very lucky to have two distinguished speakers here and two outstanding discussants. The first speaker will be Steve Cole, President, New America Foundation. He's currently president of this foundation, and he served as a managing editor of Washington Post quite several years, and he wrote a very famous book, Ghost Wars, which received a Pulitzer Prize. That book received many awards. Pulitzer Prize, as you know, this is a very prestigious and worldly well-known award, and he received by writing that book. And we have a second speaker, Dr. Volker Perthes. He is currently the chairman and director of German Institute for International and Security Affairs, and he's also teaching at Humboldt University and Free University of Berlin, and also he did a lot of research on Middle East and Africa. And we have two discussants. Ambassador Lee Tae-sik, he's currently senior advisor, SK Energy Corporation, and he served as ambassador to the United States of America. And he was Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade, ROK. And we have another discussant, Professor Park Tae-ho. He's a professor at Graduate School of International Studies, Seoul National University. He was a member of Presidential Commission on National Economy, chairman of Korea International Trade Commission, and he was the dean of the school, Graduate School of International Studies of Seoul National University. We have very seasoned experts today. I expect this session will turn out to be very insightful and informative. Just for a few ground rules, I'd like to allocate 20 minutes to each speaker to give their talk. After that, we will have discussant commenting on the presentation for about 10 minutes. Then we'll open our discussion to the floor for comments and questions. Okay, shall we begin from President Call?
Thank you, President Park. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. The New America Foundation is another think tank. We're headquartered in Washington, D.C. We have an interest in public policy and its intersections with new technology. The chairman of our board is Eric Schmidt, who is the chairman of Google, the corporation, and a thinker in his own right. And that will explain some of my presentation today. President Park, in his kind introduction, used twice the word volatility, and that is going to be the subject of my talk. When we speak about resilience and governance and some of the challenges we face in a multipolar or nonpolar, certainly a changing world, we often observe that volatility is a feature of the scene. I hope, for the sake of our hardworking translators, that this word volatility in English has a good equivalent in Korean. I don't know whether it does or not, but it refers to the tendency of things to move back and forth very quickly and unpredictably at an increasing rate of speed. And the reason I want to talk about volatility is that I think in order to have a successful conversation about resilience and governance, we need to understand a little more deeply what problems we are struggling with. And I think technology lies at the heart of many of them to a greater degree than our public discourse sometimes allows. The typical way of describing the problems of a nonpolar or multipolar world is to refer to the leadership gaps that were so well discussed this morning in Dr. Volker's panel, very intelligently discussed, to talk about the changing nature of great power states in the world, the rise of non-state actors, economic imbalances. These are all valid and important frameworks. I don't mean to challenge their validity, but I want to add to them by talking about structure. And if I leave you with one idea in my 20 minutes, it is that a subject we should be considering is volatility itself. And volatility is a product of the new connectivity in the world, the emergence of digital information systems that link unprecedented numbers of people together and present them, as importantly, with unprecedented amounts of data, and speeds up the interaction between these diverse people and this data. I put this quote from Robert Oppenheimer, who was present at the test of the first nuclear weapon, on the screen, because as I've been working on this subject of volatility in recent weeks, I've reflected on those moments in history when scientists understood how something they had brought forward into the world had changed the structure of global politics before political leaders did. And one example of such a moment was that moment when physicists, during the interwar period and then during the secret projects in the United States during the Second World War, and then to some extent after the Second World War, scientists understood how nuclear weapons and nuclear physics were going to change global politics before political and military leaders did. And one of the consequences of this gap was a period of terrible volatility during the 1950s and 1960s, culminating in the Cuban Missile Crisis, when political and military leaders had all sorts of crazy ideas about how nuclear weapons might be used until they were sort of sobered by the Cuban Missile Crisis. One of the features of Moore's Law, which is the principle that computing will become less expensive and more powerful by orders of magnitude over time, is that technological disruptions have become a feature of political life, and they're speeding up. The pace of them and the disruptive power of them is speeding up. The disruption that I'm interested in is the one at the bottom of my list there, which is the global politics of a high-speed, worldwide, citizen-influenced connectivity, a bottom-up network of empowered people, people empowered with unprecedented amounts of information. More than 50% of the population today has access to some combination of mobile telephones and the internet, and the percentage is rising every year. That statistic may sound familiar to you. It's often enunciated in one form or another. As important, the amount of data, information that is available to this plugged-in world is rising currently at a pace of about 40% per year, according to McKinsey. That means more people plugged in with access to more data and able to work with that data much faster than before. Now, what a network scientist will tell you is that when you put these factors together, you will get volatility. It's as fundamental to the principles of the network that now shapes our economies, our financial markets, our politics, as the physics was to the emergence of nuclear weapons as a challenge to the global peace. Connectivity among dispersed users plus increasing speeds plus more and more data equals volatility. And it is something that we all recognize from the financial markets, that computer-generated trading and arbitrage, that is, the attempt to locate gaps in the numbers and make profits by closing on them quickly, has been a feature of our financial markets increasingly over the last 20 years. But that's just one example of what I want to argue is a broader and more political structure. So let me try to apply my hypothesis, because that's really what it is. It's just an idea that I wanted to try to work through in the context of this panel, to four global imbalances that we recognize in more conventional discussion. So those are resources and global warming, trade imbalances, economic imbalances, imbalances of income and opportunity, and military imbalances. So scientists tell us emphatically that as we force more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, we will make the weather itself more volatile. We lack a carbon price that will slow this process down, and so we will get more volatility in the weather, that we know. But the consequences of resource competition and global warming together are likely, it seems to me, and I think the evidence is before us, to create a new pace of volatility in resource pricing and resource access. Just think about the food prices that we have endured in this world over the last 4 or 5 years, not just the spike in 2007 or the fall in 2008 and 9, and then the refiring of food inflation this year. Of course, commodity prices are by their nature volatile. That is the nature of commodities. But the speed at which this is occurring and the consequences of it, I think, requires some of our attention. Oil prices are another example. They grew by 7-fold to the peak in 2008. Such shocks in oil prices are now correlated with recessions, and indeed, they certainly occurred simultaneously with the breaking of the housing bubble and the global financial crisis. Paul Volcker talked this morning about China's unsustainable export-led strategy and the trade and currency surpluses that it has accumulated while the United States carried out its own unsustainable policies of borrowing and taking on debt in every sector of the economy. And one thing that's interesting about that more familiar subject of global economic imbalance is a very, very serious and important one, is to ask why did China, he asked the question this morning, why did the world allow China to accumulate $3 trillion in surpluses? Why did China feel motivated to do so? Since it had to park the surpluses in dollars anyway, limited their value, their usefulness, still does. Well, remember, China and other Asian governments, including this one, were self-insuring as they built these surpluses to provide their own resilience. Why? Because of the Asian financial crisis in 1999 that had so devastated the weaker victims of that volatile bubble that burst. So it was in reaction to volatility that these governments were motivated to accumulate unsustainable balances. That is just an example of why I think volatility itself is a subject of some rising interest. Now, the politics of connectivity have been discussed much this year because of the obvious connection that social media and political organizing have displayed in the Arab world so unexpectedly. There are those who argue that the surprise of the Arab Spring is itself an example of how a connected world will produce political shocks from the bottom up more often than in previous eras. This subject of the Arab Spring is much too large to discuss in the context that I'm presenting today, but I would take note, if you just think about the speed at which the tactics, ideas, language, and politics of Tunisia's revolution spread, not just to Egypt and Syria and Yemen and elsewhere in the Arab world, but rather quickly to Tel Aviv and to New Delhi, and today still manifesting itself on streets of cities in the United States, including on Wall Street. Now, this particular spread of volatile connectivity politics, I think we would regard, at least certainly as Americans, we would regard it as benign. It was motivated by a rejection of corruption. It was citizen-based. It was aspirational. And I do believe it has all those characteristics. But I also believe that politics that spread in that pattern will not always be benign. What I think we should be interested in is some of the structure and the repetition of these shocks. In military affairs as well, competition between states is now going to be influenced by the role of speeded up connected computer networks. The United States launched its cyber command this year in response to that perception. But governments will not be the only players. I think the only point I would make about the military aspect of this is that the structure of connectivity means that surprise attack is now, the pathway by which surprise attack would occur is changing. 9/11 was an example of that, but in the cyberspace, it's going to be even more likely that there will be surprise attacks because of the attribution advantages that the attacker has in some of these spaces. So if something like what I'm describing is true, and it's just a hypothesis, I'm putting it out as much to stimulate your thinking as to persuade you of an argument, then it does present the question, what should we do about it? And I think the answer has to do, first of all, with recognizing the nature of the problem. And that includes an understanding, an acceptance that in some settings, perhaps in many settings, volatility is harmful. And it should not just be accepted as inevitable or constructive simply because it is an outgrowth of technological evolution, it's an outgrowth of free market competition, things that we generally applaud. But Republican governments have long recognized the need for circuit breakers, shock absorbers, checks and balances. And I think in the policy realm, the development of circuit breakers and shock absorbers, things that slow down the process. In the American system, it was Thomas Jefferson, I think, who famously said that the Senate was, of the two houses of Congress, deliberately designed to be the saucer that cooled down the hot liquid of the House of Representatives, that the cooling period was necessary for deliberative government to function over time. And I think that is the overarching policy implication of volatility. Now, to take this back down to earth a little bit, I think when you review the crises that attract our attention today on the global stage, in each of these cases, we're testing our ability to respond to this changing structure of global politics, either through cooperation, through regional government, through global cooperation of a new type, or through innovation in the way that we construct policy in response to complex problems. And what's interesting about this list, that you could add 5 or 10 other examples, as test cases for the world's ability to function in this multipolar or nonpolar or disruptive or volatile. You can come at the structure that we're in from lots of angles of vision. But the challenge is a new form of cooperation. And I think what's interesting to me about this list is that if you look at the easy ones, relatively speaking, and you basically, let's ask the question, how is the world doing in constructing responsive cooperative regimes to problems of the character that I've described? And I would say that when the conduct at issue is outside of norms, the world is showing an ability to cooperate in new ways that is fairly encouraging in my estimation. I would put terrorism and piracy on that list. Those are examples where you have lots of strange bedfellows, as we say in American politics. People who don't normally work together are working together because they do see shared interests, and then they're able to develop cooperative mechanisms. But that's because the problem is outside of all of their shared norms. Now, when you move to something in the middle of legitimacy, let's take one step further away from pure crime towards, say, cyber activity, hacking, and the disruption of intellectual property and various kinds of attacks and misuses of an undergoverned cyberspace. Well, there I think it's a more mixed picture. It's when the activity of cyber hacking is a crime, cooperation tends to be stronger. But when this activity is, for example, a kind of proxy for early skirmishing between American and Chinese sort of military theorists or other kinds of innovators in military technology, then it's been much less easy to contain. And then when you take a subject that goes to the heart of governance prerogatives, that is not outside the norm, but is at the heart of what governments do, set a price on carbon or govern a currency like the euro collectively. So far, the results have been much less encouraging, where the need for cooperation in completely new paradigms impinges upon historical sovereignties or democratic politics, or both. So far, we have yet to find a way to make it work very well. So it leads me back to this search for solutions, and ultimately in this connected model that I've tried to sketch, citizens will be critical. And I do think that not only governments and corporations and bankers, but the public itself will have to come to terms with these shocks and with the policy responses to them. And I think that they are likely to become a regular feature of the life of citizens around the world. And they will test our resilience, both as individuals and as members of bodies politic. But we'll have to find a politics of calm and cooperation and collective approaches. And I do think that public opinion and public education about the structure of the world that we live in will therefore be critical. So I'm pleased to be a part of this conference and this conversation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, President Cole, for your very thought-provoking presentation. And now we move to next speakers. Volker Perthes. Professor Volker Perthes, please. Thanks. You keep time.
Well, thank you so much, President Park. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Volker Perthes. I'm the Director, Executive Chairman of the German Institute for International and Security Affairs, which is a main foreign policy think tank in my country. And I try to fix my things here on the, it's not so easy. I guess my remarks will be a little bit more traditional than the ones we've just heard from Steve Cole, but they will build on what Steve said, and I will delve more into some of the concrete questions I guess, of global governance and policy challenges. Once speaking for the international community, if we still can call it like that, and then making a few remarks on the challenges for Europe and probably also for Korea. Indeed, as the panel title suggests, the world is increasingly complex and unpredictable, and it is far from being stable. Especially Western policymakers, I cannot judge about Asian policymakers, but Western policymakers have only gradually realized that globalization, which was something that we cherished because it departed from the West, that globalization pertains not only to opportunities, but also involves risks. There is a globalization of risk as much as there is a globalization of opportunities or chances. Threats and risks also become borderless, as it were. And that builds on the volatility paradigm, which we just heard from Steve Cole. Threats, risks do tend to travel much faster and to migrate, as it were, not only across regions, but also across policy fields. Think of infectious diseases, for example. Of course, they travel. Think of economic shocks. They travel, and they travel not only from one region to the other, they travel through policy fields. Think of a financial crisis or a housing bubble starting in the United States and affecting countries that were not even part of the global financial markets. Countries like Tajikistan, for example, where suddenly migrant workers would come home, no more remittances would be there from the countries where they worked. So countries were at the receiving end of the financial crisis, even though they had no role in it. Or think of, I think Steve Cole also mentioned that in order to fight global warming, a lot of the industrialized countries were betting on biofuels, but then increased production of biofuels did have effects on the world food market and affected citizens in countries that, again, had very little to do actually with global warming. As to the unpredictability of the world, I think we have to qualify that a little bit. Yes, the world is unpredictable, but there have always been unexpected events in history, and I would claim that if we speak about the latest crisis or shocks, we can take the Arab Spring, which Steve Cole mentioned, or we can take the world economic and financial crisis. In both cases, we did know all the factors that did contribute to these upheavals or crises. They were all known. There were no black swans, no unknown unknowns. What we didn't do is we actually didn't connect the factors. We didn't know how these factors would interact. And there is also something which we probably could call the intellectual laziness of both policymakers and sometimes experts. We don't want to think about breaking points. We don't want to connect factors in a way that make a bad case scenario. I can tell you a little anecdote. My institute, once a year, always to year's end, makes a paper which it only distributes in 50 copies to the most influential policymakers in our country. And there we develop like 10 scenarios. And one of the scenarios last year was that the food crisis would eventually arrive in Egypt, there would be enormous riots in Egypt, the military would take over, and our policymakers said, no, this is totally crazy. I mean, don't speak about these kind of things. Egypt is a stable country. Mubarak has been there for 30 years, and because he has been there for 30 years, we think he is stable and he will manage. So that is a sort of intellectual laziness which I think sometimes experts and policymakers do share. Now, speaking of interdependencies in this world, in a globalized security environment, it is almost universally accepted now that no state and no alliance of states is able to cope with, let alone solve, global challenges, be that the international financial stability, be that terrorism, be that infectious diseases, climate change, or the spread of weapons of mass destruction. And the same goes for protected regional conflicts that still make for a lot of the epiphenomena on the security front, such as terrorism, for example. I would claim that the main security challenges the world has to deal with are basically two. That's an abstraction, of course. The one is unresolved regional conflicts, and the other are problems of or lack of governance. And we could speak of global governance here as much as of local governance. When we speak of local governments failing, we're speaking of failing states. When we speak of global governance failing, we're speaking of our failure, for example, to address global warming or climate change. Now, all relevant actors have to, and mainly know that they have to cooperate in forms of global governance. This has included the emergence of the G20 as the main format for economic policy coordination. It has included the emergence of something which we have called coalitions of the relevant, such as a Proliferation Security Initiative or the Major Economies Forum and others, contact group for Afghanistan, and it has included the enhancing or the deepening of some regional arrangements such as ASEAN here, and most recently even the Arab League, and of course, to an extent, the European Union. Now, when we speak of these formats, the G20 or the Major Economies Forum or the Proliferation Security Initiative, that's all formats which have been created in order to make global governance and global cooperation more effective. And one of the problems is that effectiveness is not necessarily going along with legitimacy. But we have seen, whether that's in the Occupy Wall Street movement or in Egypt or Tunisia, that legitimacy is becoming more and more a resource which we must not miss out on. So despite the probably greater effectiveness of something like the G20, there is still today no alternative to the much more legitimate United Nations system. And the G20, I would claim, cannot replace the United Nations. The United Nations will be there, and it will be, with all its deficiencies, the most legitimate international forum, international body we have. In order to make it both keep its legitimacy, not lose it, and become more efficient, a reform of the United Nations, especially of the United Nations Security Council, is still essential, is still needed, but it is stuck, as we all know. Now, I'm not necessarily speaking for my own country here, which seems to think that if only we and a couple of others also become permanent members of the Security Council, the problem was solved. I don't think it will be. I guess in the future we will have to think here about new formats, even for something like the Security Council, that go beyond the distinction between one select group of permanent members with veto powers and another group of elected but non-permanent members with lesser rights. More flexible arrangements here may also better represent a globalized world with more fluid structures and more networked relations between states and societies, where not only states are players, but also NGOs, business, academia, and others. From a European perspective, and I cannot deny that I'm speaking from a European perspective, it is important that other members of the G20 gain a stronger representations in the institutions of global government and take on more responsibility to safeguard global public goods such as international peace and security, development, and world climate and environment. Now, I'm cautioning a little bit that easy solutions will probably not help us very much here. Simply giving more voice or more weight to emerging powers in international fora is a good idea, and it's a correct idea, I guess, but it doesn't automatically make these institutions of global governance more effective or more legitimate. Consider, among other things, that obviously once you have more players at the table in the Security Council or in other forums, decisions do not become easier. Someone said this morning that world governments or global governments by consensus is very unlikely. So the more players you have at the table, the more difficult it is to get to a decision, to get to a yes. Then, of course, we see that rising powers, emerging powers, do not necessarily accept the rules and the regimes that have been established by the powers that are the dominant powers today. Think only about the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is not accepted by all the rising powers. Or think of the privileges of the 5 permanent members, among other things, the privilege to have nuclear weapons, which are certainly not respected or accepted by all rising powers. Think of India, for example, that doesn't accept the privilege of the 5 P5 members to have nuclear powers. Then we Europeans, and I guess Americans also, we sometimes tend to think, well, it would be good to have Brazil in the Security Council and South Africa because they do represent their regions. Now, mind you, when we're speaking about certain countries representing their regions, they are not necessarily seen as representatives of their regions by their neighbors. When we think Brazil should be in the Security Council, we will hear some nasty things from the Argentinians. So if we think South Africa should represent Africa in the Security Council, the Nigerians will have something to say, etc. And then we see, of course, that emerging and rising powers sometimes rise in a way that is seen as threatening by their neighbors. I guess you can tell stories here from the rise of China. I also think that if we speak about global and regional governance, we have to address together the question of how we really can develop what we call comprehensive approaches to security challenges. I guess it is true for Asia as much as it is for the United States or Europe, that it is still much easier to make $1 billion or euros or whatever available for a military mission than to make $100 million or euros available for a civilian conflict prevention engagement. There is something wrong in our approaches to dealing with conflicts and crises. It is still easier to raise money for a military mission than for civilian prevention that would make that military mission unnecessary. And we have, of course, and I think we have together to think about what the implications of the Arab Spring are beyond the Arab world. One thing we all, I think, should learn from the Arab Spring, from the revolts in Tunisia and Egypt and other states is that our concept of stability was probably wrong. Too often, policymakers in our countries have confused political stagnation with stability. And I think if the Arab Spring teaches us one thing, then it is that we need a dynamic concept of stability that allows a dynamic stability that also allows for change, that makes change possible, because if change is possible, systems will remain more stable in the end. If I have, how much do I have left, Mr. Chairman? 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Let me make a few remarks on Europe, because it has been discussed so intensively this morning. If you ask Europeans about what they are in the world, they would very often still consider Europe, the European Union, a model both for rules-based cooperation between states and what we call ever closer integration of states. And sometimes it's true, we are considered by others as a source of inspiration for cooperation and integration. However, I think that would be a passing phenomenon if we don't live up to our own ambitions. The current euro crisis, as Paul Volcker and others said this morning, is more than just a sovereign debt crisis of some countries. It is a sovereign debt crisis of some countries, but it is also a governance crisis of Europe. It is the result of a lack of common governance in the Eurozone and in the EU. And ultimately, I was very happy to hear that both from Asian and from American speakers this morning, ultimately what we have in Europe as monetary union will not work without a closer political union, or at least a fiscal union. And I think we are on the way to go there. It was said this morning also that the current moment of crisis must not be missed. And my impression is that after almost missing it for a year and a half or 2 years, European leaders now are starting to bring up the courage to convince their own publics that deeper integration, at least in the realms of fiscal policy and social policy, is indeed needed, and that only that will allow Europe to invest more into its own innovation and make Europe stronger. The choice for Europe in what rightly has been called a multipolar world, the choice for Europe, I think, is either to be a pole in this multipolar world or to be polarized among itself or in itself. And if we don't want to be polarized, we have to go on. We have to deepen our integration. We have to make our integration more democratic by having a truly representative European Parliament and by continue over monetary union to fiscal and political union. And I guess if we come back here in 10 years for the Global HR Forum in 2021, we will see the fiscal union in Europe being implemented. Things always take longer, but this is probably the way it is. Now, one last remark, since I'm in this country, on Korea. There's nothing Europeans or European contributors should tell Koreans about what they should do or how Korea should exercise its responsibility in the world. It is encouraging for us, for Europeans, to see Korean policymakers, and I heard some of them this morning, speak about a greater responsibility Korea wants to take on in the world, because this is indeed necessary. Especially speaking from Berlin and not speaking from Washington, I would like to say that the international system in the future will not be shaped by great powers alone. Great powers will be there, but without the strong contribution of middle powers, it will simply not work. And therefore, I hope that Korea will continue to play its creative and constructive role in the G20, but also assume more responsibility in other aspects of international and also regional governance. It may be a deficient view from Europe, but I see that the main things that is still missing, the main things that is still missing in Asia is a robust regional security system. And if you allow me one very German remark to our Korean friends, I mean, we have so many similarities in history, having been divided for a long time, and Germany, then unification happened when we did not longer expect it. If you want to make your neighbors accept unification, the one real thing you have to do in front of that or before that is to resolve or try to resolve territorial and other regional conflicts. Otherwise, it couldn't be the other part of your country that makes most difficulties when unification comes up at one point, but rather neighbors who would mistrust a greater country, a bigger country. We have experienced that, and I'm not saying that Korea will follow the German way, but I think you sometimes look to the old European continent when you think of the future of your country. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Chairman Volcker, for your very informative observation and very kind and insightful suggestions for Korean friends. Okay, next speaker is Ambassador Lee. You have 10 minutes. Yeah, you can.
Thank you. Well, this is very interesting discussion as well as observations on the part of Mr. Cole and Dr. Pertes, particularly because both of them came up with very interesting subject in describing the shape of current world affairs. Mr. Cole came up with the concept of volatility, while Dr. Pertes came up with the unpredictability and uncertainty. The two concepts are somewhat intertwined and interrelated. Here, it's a bit interesting for me to observe this, not least because when we talk about this current international world affairs, whether it being Arab Spring or global economic or financial crisis, yes, there was the volatility, yes, there was the unpredictability. But the question there was whether we were able to predict, foresee a certain ominous things to come. And this is the key question, and particularly when we look at what happened in Arab countries this spring. Yes, as Mr. Pertes stated, perhaps Western world has been opted for too much on stability versus democracy and so forth. But that kind of traditional wisdom has been always there. And the Western scholars have always said the Arab countries are exceptional. And there you do not find any fertile soil for democracy to flourish for a variety of reasons, historically, culturally, and otherwise. We were in this stereotyped thinking about Arab politics. And yet, at the end of the day, what we have observed rather abruptly, that was Arab Spring. It didn't come out of blue. There was the kind of seed, there was the kind of source of volatility, but we, the international community, and Western countries did not want to look at it face to face, did not admit something is going to be very early, but all the times they tend to believe that authoritarian regime and dictatorial countries will stay long as a viable power, and therefore they have to admit as it is. But overnight, the whole situation has changed. What this Arab Spring is about? The Arab Spring is about political freedom. Arab Spring is about democracy. Arab Spring is about human rights. Arab Spring is about unemployment and so forth. So when this Arab Spring took place, starting from Tunisia, through Egypt and elsewhere, what the Western countries have done, their position was somewhat ambiguous at the beginning. As time goes by, they took side with the street, but they couldn't do much about it. Why? The Arab politics were very volatile, and therefore nobody was in the mood to intervene rather prematurely. Another aspect of this Arab Spring, to explain why Western hesitancy has been there, perhaps the kind of potential conflict between Islamist and West. After the Arab Spring, if Islamist comes to power and play as an important power player in Arab politics, then West will not be in good shape, and they will be worse off. So there is a certain hesitancy and caution involving this possibility of Islamists coming to power. But at the same time, the potential conflict between Iranian revolution and Saudi Arabian sort of status quo power. Particularly, the region is important over the oil and so forth. So we can understand the hesitancy, but at the same time, we cannot understand why international community has not been predicting something well before, and when the situation gets worse, why we were not able to do something rather actively. At the same time, when it comes to this economic and financial volatility or crisis, it's engulfing the whole world. It's not solely the problem for the United States and the EU. The whole world economy is suffering from that, suffering from the problems. Yes, G20 has been created rather in the aftermath of this crisis. Whether this is functioning well to come up with a new regime to handle the economic crisis and so forth, it remains to be seen. But the question here is again, when it comes to this economic and financial volatility, why the international community was not able to cope with the situation, and why the Western countries were not in a position to predict something in advance. And only when the situation got worse, we came to know that this is a serious situation. You remember that what happened in Asia back in 1997 and 1998. The shock came not overnight, but we knew that something is coming. And we were in trouble. What we have gone through with is the painstaking restructuring process. And that really turned out rather well. Again, this second crisis emanated from Western world. This is sending the shock wave globally. The whole world economy is suffering from it. Whether this G20 is a good forum or not, that is not question. What kind of new rules of law will be emerging out of this situation? Another point I like to make based on the two presentations. Yes, in Asia, we're going to have something which has been the topic of active discussion nowadays, and that is the rise of China and its impact in East Asian relationship. It's really something that we have to be very actively following, and yet whether China's intention is going to be peaceful or not, that we don't know. But as a country which is in the neighborhood of a big country like China, it raises a lot of potential concern. Throughout our history, we have engaged with China one way or another, but our historical experience is not always positive. Now, China's hegemonic status, if you don't mind, and China's rising status will have to be somewhat peaceful in the region. In order for us to see that, the United States and Western world, whether they can do something about it, that is one of the questions that we have. But at the same time, as you talked about the unification for Korea, Korea's unification is something that we have to push through in the future. How we can do that? Unless we are assured of China's cooperation on that, the prospect will not be bright. But if you are talking about do away with the territorial dispute, in the neighborhood or in the region, it's going to be very tough and difficult. For the nature of territorial dispute, it's not going to be resolved rather soon. But more importantly, we are looking forward to more positive attitude and response from Beijing. Since time is running out, let me just stop here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ambassador Lee. And now, Professor Park, it's your turn. We have 10 minutes to go.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, the program I was given in Korean language, the title of the session is quite different from the title in English version. In other words, title of the session in Korean version, if I translate into English, is a new power shift of the world. And then in English version, totally different topic. So while I was waiting for the reading material from the authors, I prepared a little bit of my own thought on the first topic. So I rather want to discuss some of my thought on this new power shift, and then I will comment on global governance issues both presenters touch upon. What I'd like to discuss a little bit during my discussion time is about rising Asia. First of all, I have to define Asia. Asia, you have to look at East Asia, South Asia, and Central Asia. If I define that way, maybe we talk about the 49 countries in Asia. And also, if you look at the history, economic history, then you can also find very easily, before Industrial Revolution, the Asia's economic size was over 60% of the world economy, like 200 years ago. And later on, it declined to 15%, and right now, it rebounds to be 28%. At this moment, I would like to introduce a report published by Asian Development Bank very recently. The title of the report was Asia 2050, Realizing the Asian Century. This is a very interesting report, and it predicts in 2050, Asia's economic size will be 52% of the world economy. And if you look at North America, it's only 13%, Europe 18%, Latin America and South America 10%. So Asia will be emerging as a major economic power in the future. Especially within Asia, the ADB mentioned 7 key countries, which include China, Japan, India, Indonesia, Korea, Malaysia, and Thailand. So this report says, how can we make East Asian economy grow like this? They identify several drivers which may provide some opportunities, but also at the same time, it can create some crisis too. So it depends on how you manage this kind of drivers. Several drivers, one of them, if I just say a few drivers, technological change is one of the important element. Demographic and labor force changes is also a very important issue. Capital deepening, emerging middle-class population. It's very interesting. Within Asia, by 2050, more than 3 billion people will enter into so-called middle-class population, which has strong implication on Korea, because if you have 3 billion people claim that they are a middle-income population, then what do they demand? They demand for very interesting items like refrigerator, air conditioner, smartphone, cars, So Korea is very good at this kind of manufacturing of those kind of commodities right now. So maybe that's why ADB gives very strong points on Korea's potential growth in the future. Not today, but in the future. They also identify climate change and communication revolution as another interesting drive. So to realize the Asian century in the future, I think all Asian countries should be careful in managing these opportunities into a great success. ADB reports also identify a few challenges, very important fundamental challenges. One of them was inequalities and disparities. I think some of the presenters mentioned imbalances in many, many different aspects, and also middle income trap, global competition for scarce resources, climate change again, and then Asia's role in global governance. So in other words, to overcome all these kind of challenges, then we can make this kind of Asian century in the future. If you fail, then the size of the economic size of the Asia will be much smaller than 52%. So it all depends on how to manage this kind of drivers and also crises. So now let me just touch upon a little bit on global governance. Well, I'm an economist. Maybe other gentlemen are more political scientists or some other field. So I only talk about this time global governance on international trade, for example. Previous speakers mentioned many other global governances, but if you look at the international trade field, we have, as you know, World Trade Organization, which was established in 1995. Very ambitiously, they launched first so-called multilateral trade negotiations called Doha Round. It was supposed to be concluded in 2004. And as you know, WTO's decision-making is depending upon consensus among 153 countries. And also, we have a huge emerging economies as a member. But in any case, we passed the deadline by 7 years, and we don't know where to go. As you know, world economy is in a very difficult situation. Then if you look at the history, in that kind of difficult situation, many countries turn to be more protectionist kind of position. In other words, major countries, because their domestic economies are not very good, they want to protect their own domestic economies by raising trade barriers. So I think in this kind of development into protectionism kind of activities will be very, very difficult to Asian economies, because Asian economies still think international trade is a very important engine for economic growth. So in any case, very unfortunately, this WTO's new round, so-called new governance on international trade is failing, and WTO is facing a most serious crisis since its birth in 1995. So what about the global governance participation of Asian economies? Somebody mentioned G20, and Korea also is taking some responsibilities in global governance. But if you look at the major issues at the WTO, every issues are divided by advanced countries like US and EU versus China, India, and Brazil. But I don't want to mention Brazil because I'm only focused on Asia. So unless these two large, huge emerging economies take more futuristic and more substantial responsibilities in global governance, we cannot resolve this kind of very important issue at the WTO. So I'd like to mention that these emerging and growing large Asian economies should take more proactive positions in global governance to save the global governance on international trade. Lastly, I'd like to touch upon a little bit on East Asian economic integration. Unlike North America and Europe, there's no such Asian economic integration, especially in Asia or even in East Asia. We have ASEAN, but this is a little bit different story. But fortunately, since 4 years ago, major countries in Northeast Asia, like Korea, China, Japan, 3 leaders start to meet once a year regularly since 4 years ago. And we still have some rivalry situation between China and Japan. I think these 3 countries are considering some kind of economic integration in Asia more seriously in the future. Fortunately, to support trilateral summit meetings, they created a little secretariat office. It happened to be located in Seoul, and this office started its function last month. So maybe in the future, in many different interesting areas, Korea, Japan, China can make some effort in having more closer cooperation in the future. I will stop my comment here.
Okay, thank you, Professor Park. I think now it's time to, we should give a few minutes each to two speakers to respond to some of the comments and questions raised by the two discussants. So you have a couple of minutes to respond, please.
Thanks to both of the discussants for their thoughtful remarks. Ambassador Lee asked a question that I wrote down and thought I would just say something about, which is, he asked in effect, what can we predict? And then Volker in his talk provided the example of forecasting the revolution in Egypt. And it's a very important question. I don't know the answer to it, but I thought I would offer a straw man or a hypothesis. The easiest things to predict are those which are predictable by sound science. So global warming is predictable. It will occur unless we intervene against it. I think it is almost as easy to predict changes that are rooted in durable human aspiration. So the search for human societies for security, but also increasingly rights and dignity to go along with their comfort and security. And I think the thing that's hardest to predict, especially in the structure of the world that we're in now, are systemic shocks that are generated by small actors, because the system empowers small entrants and reduces barriers to their activity. And it would be beyond our capacity, I think, so far to monitor and assess how each and every one of those shocks is going to originate. So then, if I could just make one other comment, less abstract, just to say something about Europe and global governance. I was struck by the end of Volker's presentation, and both of the discussants have raised Europe as a model, an example of global governance. Obviously, a lot of discussion because of the headlines. You know, I think I was encouraged by Volker's assessment that in 2021 we will have a fiscal union, and perhaps Europe will find its way toward something like a political union. The world needs Europe to succeed desperately, I think. Only by bringing forward to completion the rules-based model that the European Union envisioned and the example of cooperation and integration among states that Europe constructed from the post-war period until today, only by finishing that project can Europe influence Asia in the ways that it will be vital for her to do, and provide a balance to the United States, frankly, I say as an American, during a period when it is going to be challenged to respond constructively to changes in great power relations. So if Europe fails, I think we'd live in a much more dangerous world. And I had been quite discouraged until just the last few weeks when European leaders started to speak in historical terms about the technical challenges they were wrestling with, and I hope that will continue.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Ambassador Lee and Professor Park. Four brief points. Ambassador Lee, you said rightly that you said Western scholars. I would qualify that and some Western scholars have been speaking of the sort of cultural immunity of the Arab world with regard to democracy. I must insist that not all scholars did see it like that. Here is one of the scholars who didn't see it like that. But you're right, that policymakers in our countries were very happy to embrace such suggestions because it was so comfortable. It was so comfortable. If scholars would tell you that these people don't want democracy in the first place, and the leaders there, the Mubaraks and Ben Ali, said, well, our people don't want democracy, so it was much more comfortable for European policymakers to deal with them. And the only thing I want to say, beware of the same analogy in Asia. We have heard actually many Arab politicians telling us that they are in a way part of this Asian community with Asian values that doesn't value democracy and individual freedom very much, but rather collectivity and harmony. Now again, here we may make the same mistake. If we say that 1 billion people in China don't cherish democracy, it may be the same mistake which people have made with regard to the Arab world. Second point, things that are predictable and unpredictable. Interestingly enough, unifications, and you responded to that, Ambassador Lee, unifications seem to be unpredictable even though we have them in our constitutions. As I briefly said, unification came to Germany when we didn't expect it anymore. And our neighbors and friends were acting in different ways. We expected them to happen. We always thought that the Soviet Union will never let it happen. Now, the Soviet Union was not an obstacle to German unification. Some of our closest friends, France and Britain, were rather skeptical at the time, and we could only work over their skepticism by building a lot of trust, giving up constitutionally the right to have weapons of mass destruction, being prepared to enter a more deepened Europe, and solving all territorial issues. Now, Asia's rise is not among the unpredictables. Actually, it's no longer a prediction, it's simply a trend which is being forecast. So I would think the important issue for us with regard to policymakers is, especially when we seem to see stable trends, to tell them that even stable trends can be marked by uncertainties. Now, the rise of Asia statistically certainly is a stable trend. Look at demographics, look at economics, it's rather stable. But do we know what the territorial form of China will be in the future, or of India, or whether there would be breaking points? So I think without sort of being scaremongering, political scientists, economic scientists should make policymakers aware that you should better prepare that trends will probably continue but are not necessarily stable. There are always things that could go wrong. And my last point is, I would simply say sometimes distance helps to get clarity. And I was quite encouraged this morning that for Asian speakers, it seemed to be only logical that Europe has to go to fiscal union and political union. If I see that it took 2 years, and I concur with Steve here, 2 years for the leaders in my own country to speak out this truth, because there is so much local opposition, and some of the smaller countries don't like it, and some of the bigger countries in the EU don't like it. So it was very difficult for someone like the German Chancellor to finally, 2 weeks ago, say, yes, we have to move on to a treaty change, and it needs to be political union in the end. Distance seems to help. What seems to be very politicized and difficult in Europe seems to be so easy and simply logical from an Asian perspective, and that did encourage me. Thank you.
Thank you. We are already behind the schedule, unfortunately. In the beginning, I was planned to give some time for discussion from the floor, but we are already 5 minutes past the time which is allocated to us for this session. So unfortunately, I don't think we can have time for open discussion from the floor. I think today's session raised many, many interesting issues. We do not provide any full solutions, but we touched upon so many issues in this session. I think those issues are very important. And from now on, we have to pay more attention. We have to do more serious research, try to find out the solution for these challenges and problems. But I personally feel that there is one important problem which has not been fully touched upon, which has not been seriously discussed here. That is the problem of democracy. Steve and both of the speakers talked about the volatility issues, unpredictability issues in world economy and world politics. And Steve suggests some of the ways to absorb those shocks coming from global economy and global politics. But the problem is the liberal democracy we have been aiming for so many years, many decades, is the liberal democracy is really dependable or reliable political system in which we can solve those coming challenges, such as volatility and unpredictability. In other words, is liberal democracy is an effective tools, political system in which we can solve the coming issues of volatility and unpredictability. There has been many talk about how to regulate the market, especially since after global recession, global financial crisis, 2008. Many people talk about market is imperfect, so we have to regulate the market. But I think democracy is also very imperfect things. But there has not been much discussions, much talks about how to regulate the democracy, to deal with effectively those coming challenges from globalizations, globalized economy, globalized politics. So that is how to regulate the market. Not only how to regulate the market, but we have to think seriously about how to regulate the democracy. I think that is another important issue we have to pay more academic and attention from now on. Okay, having said that, I think I have to close this session. I'd like to thank the speakers and discussants for your very invaluable contributions, and also for audience for your attention. And I think this is time to bring this session to close. Thank you very much.
네, 수고해주신 박세일 이사장과 소중한 강연을 해주신 연사분들께 다시 한번 감사드립니다.